Welcome to How to Write Good. My name is Daniel Poppy. You can find out more about me at danielpoppy.com. You can check me out on different social medias. If you do post anything on my social medias that are not Instagram, I probably will not see it right away. So if I don't reply, it's not that I'm trying to reply. It's just that Facebook especially makes it difficult to see comments. So jump over to another one. I'm most active on Instagram just because I'm sick of doing the same exact thing, and I'm sick of trying to. It's visual, right? Instagram is almost a completely visual social media, and I like that because I'm tired of actually thinking. So check that out. You can check out my book, The Ninth Hour. You can get that on Amazon. You can also check out One Last Toast for Ebenezer Fleet, which is my serialized novel, and the 6th chapter will be coming out at the beginning of May. Gosh. So how I work, just FYI for everyone, there's a week that passes, and then the Sunday after that full week at the beginning of the month is when I post those episodes, or those chapters, I guess, because they're each a chapter by themselves. So if you're wondering when they come out, there's a week first, a full week. So if you have half a week, it actually has to go through that full week afterwards, and then I post One Last Toast for Ebenezer Fleet's chapters. So there you go. Now you'll never know when it's actually coming out. All right. Besides that, I think I'm done with all my intro stuff. The word of the week is solecism, and it means it's actually an unconventional or incorrect grammatical construction. So so there's two meanings of this. So it's ungrammatical, right? It's bad grammar, incorrect, or it is the flagrant violation of social etiquette. Solecism. All right, so that is what it is. We are going to jump into the accidental essence, and we're finished. I'm finished with all of my writing rules. Those are, hopefully you like them. Hopefully they're helpful. That's what I wanted to do. I just a quick side note before I actually get into everything else I'm going to be talking about. But when I was making those writing rules, I sat down and I'm like, what's actually going to help people to write better? What are some principles people can apply to their writing? Not necessarily do this or do that. If you look at different writing rules, so you get the most famous book is The Elements of Style by Struck and then E.B. White, who kind of edited it and changed it a bit later on. He has a lot of stuff that is just idiosyncratic. It's what he likes and what he doesn't like. So I don't know if technically in the English language, ending a sentence with a preposition is incorrect. Technically in the grammar of the English language, like how people say, when you write down the grammar, you say, oh, these are rules. But that's when you actually speak English, that's not actually a rule in the spoken English language. So it's like, okay, so that doesn't jive. So there's some rules that are pet peeves. For example, he says in that book, he says, okay, you need to try to write as little as possible to say what you're saying. And I actually disagree with that. I think that generally it's a case when you write that the writing is what would you call it? It's concise. Generally, good writing is concise. But at the same time, it depends on your reason for writing. If you're trying to get a philosophical idea across to me, then I think you should use, if it's nonfiction or if you're trying to get a philosophical idea across to me, non-creative nonfiction, then I think you should be concise, because you don't waste people's time, right? If you are trying to explain something that is nonfiction and you're not trying to be creative about it, don't waste someone's time just to get that across. Be as clear as possible and be as concise as possible, because then when somebody's going over it again, it won't take them as much time. So there's a lot of rules like that. But when you're actually writing fiction or you're writing creatively, it might be the case that you actually might have to add more words to it, because you're not dealing just with the language. You're not dealing just with trying to get specific ideas across, okay? As we understand ideas, you're not trying to get some intellectual, scientific, philosophical idea. You're not trying to get some academic idea across. In most cases, when you're writing creatively, what you're trying to get across is an experience or a feeling. And in some cases, and I do this in my own writing, you're trying to get specific philosophical ideas across, but you're trying to carry them along by a narrative. You're trying to carry them along by the thoughts of a character. And it's not always the case that people think in very specific and concise words. If you listen to me talking, I'm sure I have a lot of extra words that I don't really need if I look back on it. In some cases, you should take them out. In other cases, you don't. don't need to, just because it loses something. So that's what I wanted to do. I didn't want to make some idiosyncratic rules based on my own personal ideas, based on my own personal preferences. I wanted to make ideas and rules that were, what would you call it? More, like I said, they were principles you could use and apply to almost all writing situations. So there you go. All right, we're going to jump into our accidental lessons, and the accidental lessons today can be summed up in one sentence. It is read like a reader. Okay. So there's a basic assumption for writers, and I don't know if this is the case in other art forms, but I'm assuming it's the case in other art forms. There is a basic assumption that when you read as a writer, you should read like a writer. So what does this mean? So when you're reading like a writer, it means that you're analyzing what's going on in what is written. Okay. And I don't think this is necessarily wrong. Okay. It's not wrong that you do this, but I think that you actually have to shift your ideas. I think that it's in part wrong. Okay. I'm saying that weird, but just hear me out, I guess. So let's unpack read like a writer a bit more. So before I said you are analyzing what's being written. So let's just say you're a writer and you want to get good at writing. Okay. So you think about, okay, how can I get good at writing? How do you do that? Well, you can take a class, but what if you don't have any classes? What's the next best thing you can do to get good at writing? Besides writing itself, which you should be doing, you should be writing on a regular basis if you want to practice writing. How do people generally learn something? Actually, if you look back, most people learn by looking at other people. Most people learn so they see somebody else and they mimic what they're doing. I think children especially do this in a lot of ways. So parents don't teach bad habits to their children, but then parents suddenly notice, oh, that kid is doing the exact same bad habit that I'm doing, okay? And people assume that the biggest amount of learning people do in their life, well, maybe they don't. Maybe there's an assumption or this idea that people actually go to school and they do the most learning there, but we know that isn't true because we don't remember all the facts that we learn. But the things we do learn, we see other people doing. Okay. And I'm seeing this in my life too. There's certain things that I'm like, I'm not sure if I can do this. And the reason why I'm not certain if I can do it is because I've never seen somebody else do it. I've never seen somebody else publish a book before or go through that process. Now I've done it and I'm like, okay, I can figure this out. I am more entrepreneurial than most people. I've never seen somebody do that before. Like I've never just watched it happen. And now I'm trying to figure out how that works and see what happens and try to kind of build up how I'm going to do it. Most people in their lives look at other people, they see what those people are doing, especially people in their families or people in their social circles, and they mimic what's going on. They follow after in that way. So if you are someone who wants to learn how to write, well, one way you can actually peek in on what somebody else is doing is by reading what someone else is doing. Now, if you listen to what I had said before, you probably know what's coming up. If you listen to how I explain people learning how to do specific things, such as be entrepreneurs, or in some cases, you learn how to tie your shoe. But these ways of being, okay, ways of being are things that we don't necessarily learn consciously. They're things that we learn unconsciously, such as how we talk, or what language we use, or even how if you look at a families speak in a specific way, but they also carry themselves in a specific way. And generally they have a specific culture within that family and the way they do things. For example, my wife's family, they are people who don't shout over each other. And my family, if you're someone who is very polite, you'd go over to you'd go to, what do you call them, holidays, and we're shouting over each other and having a conversation, but the conversation is being carried on, even though one person isn't allowing the other person to finish what they're saying. Okay, so the whole idea that you go over and you're like, okay, I'm going to look how people do things, right? And then I'm going to analyze how they do this thing makes sense, right? We've done this, not our whole entire lives, but we've done this all of schooling. So this analysis of what somebody else is doing is something that we have done throughout all our schooling. So it's something that we automatically go to. Okay. But I think we should go, back in time a bit. If you're a writer, or even if you do something else, even if you play an instrument, even if you, what would you call it? even if you paint or do some other creative thing, think back to when you got that bug. Think back to when you're like, wow, like I really, really like this and I want to do it. You may have been really bad the majority of your life and needed to get lessons. You may have been someone who needed to actually sit down and learn the basics of how to do something. You can't write unless you're actually capable of writing and you know the alphabet and different things like that. So there's a certain level of knowledge that you need and skill that you need, because there's the ability to write using the English language is a skill, right? And so you have knowledge and you pair it with what you're doing and you get a skill, whatever, something like that. But when you got the writing bug, you're probably younger. When you were thinking, man, I'd love to write for a career, I'd love to do writing full time, or I just love to write books and not necessarily do it full time, which is kind of where I'm at right now. I'm like, hey, I want to write books. If I can't do it full time, that's all right. But when you did it, you were probably younger, and maybe you were 12, maybe yesterday you're like, man, I really like this. And ask yourself, why did you want to write so much? And I would bet that you got swept up in a story or you got swept up in the actual writing. Okay? You got swept up in a story, you got swept up in an actual writing. And if you're someone who did decide, man, I really like this, I want to keep this up, you're kind of weird, I think. I think you're weird, but that's all right. When you did this, did you analyze the writing? In some cases, people go to college and then they realize they need this. They need to gain a better understanding of what's going on in the writing. So they're analyzing the writing. For example, maybe somebody never thought Shakespeare was good. Shakespeare was good at what he did. He speaks a different language. I've already talked about this before. I'm not going back into it. But they read Shakespeare, and then the professor points out all these different things Shakespeare is doing and all the different layers that he puts into it. And then suddenly they're like, wow, this is really cool. I really like this. This is some really Game of Thrones type stuff. I've never read Game of Thrones, so I'm just speaking ignorantly right here. But there's all this stuff going on and all these things happening, and this is really cool. So maybe that happened. They analyzed the writing, and then suddenly they're like, man, I really love this. I want to do something like it. So even in that approach, even when that happens, you're not just loving that because of the analysis. I don't think you're loving that just because of the analysis. And if you're younger and you started to love writing or another art form, I don't think you're loving that just because of the analysis. I think that you love the art form because of what the art form does, because of how you connect to the art form, whether that's writing or painting or whatever, whether that's writing or visual art, music, whatever. I think it happens mostly with music. It's when you started to learn, then instead of doing it intelligently and analyzing and then trying to mimic and stuff like that, maybe you did mimic, you just did trial and error and you kind of stumbled forward, which isn't necessarily good, we would think. But trial and error, even though it can be very time consuming, is something that can actually hone our ability to do something. We aren't just taking somebody else's rules and applying them. We're actually exploring for ourselves. I think there is a time that you should do trial and error. And I think there's a time when you should look back and you should look at the prevailing wisdom of the age, and you should be like, okay, or the prevailing wisdom that deals with your art form. And you should be like, okay, is this good or is this bad? Should I apply to what I'm doing already? And if I can improve what I'm doing, that's great. If I come up with a subpar thing or I lose something, right? Because that's a thing I notice a lot. People, this happens a lot with stories, and people get better as they write. Okay, so I'm not saying people are stuck here at all. I think that if you're going to continue to write, continue to develop, this can just be a stage in a long succession of you writing that brings you to a point where you're an excellent writer. Not everybody's going to be phenomenal right away. Pretty much no one is. There's like 5 huge prodigies in the world, something like that. I'm just making that number up. But something like that, and there's only a few prodigies. You have these 12-year-old kids who are already graduated college, who are running corporations, right? I'm also making this up. Don't take it as gospel truth. But where was I going? Now I'm done. Okay, so trial and error. What I was talking about before was trial and error. And the thing about it is okay, this is where I was. The thing about it is with trial and error is you could say, okay, instead of trial and error, I'm going to go over here. I'm going to follow the prevailing wisdom. I'm going to follow this straightforward, these different steps to write a story. And maybe it was the case that you had something. Maybe there was something that really hit home. You didn't do it perfectly. You weren't able to bring about something phenomenal, but you had something that was really connecting to the person, to the actual reader. And maybe when you go to those different ways of doing things, you lose that spark, if that makes sense. Now, it could be the case that the things that you're using, those rules that you're using, for example, if you use my rules and you suddenly are like, man, this isn't helping my writing, well, maybe you shouldn't use those rules. Maybe you should just go out and you should do trial and error. But if those rules are making you lose something, I don't think that's good. I think you should try to figure out how to work through that and get better without going to that rule. If you use a story structure, and the story structure, after you're done with it, makes you feel like makes it seem like your story is kind of cut and paste. Well, first off, take your time, maybe go back to it, but see why it wasn't cut and paste before, and then hold on to that and try to carry it along. If you can't, you've got to keep on working out your story and figuring things out and analyzing your own stuff until you get there. But I digress a little bit with that. So when you learned how to write, you were swept up in the art form, right? You were swept up in what was happening, the experience that was being conveyed to you by the writing itself. I know that this happened to me. I think most people do. I think that if you are a reader and you love reading, you get swept up in what's going on. You get swept up in this experience that's being created for you. This is why I always hammer on this idea that the best kind of writing is the writing that you don't even notice when you're reading it. It's the writing that sucks you in, and all that's there is the story. The cool thing about writing, I think the cool thing about art in general, I think that music can do this too. But I think writing does this the best. I think writing, the author is gone, right? Like the author writes the book, but if the author can disappear, that is the best thing that can happen for the author, because the person is just experiencing something, okay? And that experience, in a lot of cases, is almost magical. And if you watch a really awesome movie, if you read a really great book, if you hear unbelievable music that just connects to you, you're suddenly like, wow, this is like magic, okay? So that's what I want to talk about. And I want to talk about reading in relation to this specifically. If you hear this tone, that's actually like the noon bell. Gosh, it's not even noon. I'm recording this a little early, but that's a bell, you get in the whatever, it goes off. So it can be the case when you write that you can know all the rules, that you know how to put two words together, that you can keep someone's focus with a story, but it's not something that hits a person where they live. This happens to me quite often, and I think it's partially my fault, and I think I blame the writer partially. So at a certain point for me, and I think I've fallen into a bad habit with this, is I read something, and I'm reading it, and I see everything's going on. I see they're hitting all the movements in the story, if you want to call it that. They have the tension they need and everything like that. But when I read it, I'm just like, this doesn't catch me, right? In some ways, that's my fault, because I need to just relax. I don't relax. I need to turn off my brain, and I need to read. And in other ways, that's kind of the writer's fault in a way too, because what the writer needs to do is the writer needs to figure out a way to make themselves disappear. Now, someone may not be capable of doing that, so I've got to actually do it myself, but they should keep on striving to do that until they can. Knowing the rules of the language, knowing the rules of how to write, for example, on a piece of paper is a necessity. So knowing a certain amount of rules and having a skill is a necessity to be able to write. And it will help make the narrative better in general. But I think it's just the mechanical side of things. I think that we often, I think in this day and age, that we often forget the aesthetic side of things. So for example, you can be really, really good at what you do, but like I was saying before, it can fall flat. It can be something that's not interesting. It can be something that doesn't catch people where they're at, right? And you can also be too aesthetic, where you just rely on this experience that you're trying to convey, and you don't have the ability to do anything with it, right? So if you are experiencing a huge, very strong emotional state, and you want to convey this strong emotional state, and you're a 14-year-old in high school, and you're trying to convey it, you're not going to do it very well because you don't have the tools to be able to do it. But if you're someone who's 43 years old and you're really, really good at writing, but you have nothing to convey, Well, that's not good either. And maybe you don't have anything to convey because you're just so tied up with anxiety, or you just can't focus on anything, right? This actually happens with me in almost all of life. So what happens is either I am caught up with something, and I probably did it during this podcast, but I don't really censor myself too much with this stuff, where you're just going and you get caught up with in an idea. And what happens when you get caught up in this idea is you just get you go off on a tangent and you go off wherever. And this happens with my writing too. And then there's other times where I'm following a script too much and it seems too robotic to me, and I don't connect. I don't feel like I connect to people listening in the same way. Okay. With the aesthetic of reading. So it probably was, I think that this has always been the case. I think it's always been the case that most people fall on the mechanical side of things. They fall on the side that says, if you know all these rules, you're going to be a good writer, right? I think most people do that. I think most people, especially when they hit a certain age, they say, hey, these are the specific rules I need to follow. I think this is more likely to happen with someone who plans out their stories, as opposed to, what would you call it? As opposed to just writing. People who just write, I think, probably are carried away on the aesthetic more than the actual, more than the planning side of things. But, it could be the case either way. Now, you might say, how does this have anything to do with reading? When you read, I think that you should get carried away with what you read. When you read, I think that that's what you want to achieve in the readers. And I think that you need to actually be able to get to a point where you can read something and that happens yourself. If you actually want to, mimic that. If you want to do that same thing. So if you speak a language and you know all the rules of the language, this let's just talk about Latin. So I can know all the rules in relation to Latin. Now let's take the Catholic Church out of this equation. Now, I can write Latin, I can read Latin, I can speak Latin, but can I actually speak Latin the way the Romans spoke Latin? And the answer is no. And the reason I can't speak Latin the way the Romans spoke Latin is because I have the inability to experience how they speak the language. It's kind of the same thing with any type of language. If you aren't immersed in the culture and actually hear how the language is spoken, you cannot learn that language better. It's really, really hard. Some people may be able to. It's really hard to learn a language if you are not connected to the people who speak that language. If you are not continually hearing that language. I think in the same way, it is very hard to be able to write a story or connect to people with music or to connect to people with art if you do not get swept up, if you do not experience really good art. And I think that it is hard to do that. Now, somebody might be like, well, I read a lot, and so I experience really good art. The question is are you analyzing that art constantly? Because if you are analyzing that art constantly, I don't think you're experiencing the good art. I think that your brain is getting in the way. I think that you actually need to stop analyzing it, and I think that you actually need to experience it as close as possible to the way that artist wanted you to experience that thing. Some art isn't worth your time. I think that's the case. I think that it's mostly the case when someone devalues art. I think this happens with a lot of modern art, where they just completely devalue art. They don't think it has, they don't see it as something that has any base. It doesn't have a bedrock. It doesn't have a foundation. There's no such thing as beauty, so we can do whatever we want. It's very postmodern, I guess. So I think there's a devaluation of that, and it's the artist's ideas behind that. But when you read, getting back to what I'm saying, now I'm going on a tangent again. When you read, I think that you need to experience that thing so that you can actually create something like that, right? If you've never experienced love, are you going to be able to write about love in a convincing way? If you've never experienced war, are you going to be able to write about war in a convincing way? Unless you're Stephen Crane, you're not. Stephen Crane wrote The Red Badge of Courage, and he'd never experienced war, but the people who were in war said it was very realistic. It was a very good depiction of war, which is kind of cool that he was able to do that. So you need to try to experience that thing in some way. You're trying to create something that is not completely explainable. You're trying to create something, the aesthetic, something that has intrinsic value. You're trying to create something beautiful, or something that has it's something that has value that is beyond just the utility. That's what I'm trying to say. It's something that has value that's beyond pragmatic. It's something that has value that is beyond, there's another word I'm trying to look for right now. It's beyond something useful, right? Art is something that can be useful in society in general because of who we are as people, but you can't hammer a nail with art. You're not going to learn how to do, you're not going to learn a new skill when you take in art. There's something else that happens that is very human, I guess. So your writing comes from your experiences. And if you're looking to connect people, if you're looking to connect to people through writing itself, you want to figure out, or you want to experience the aesthetic in art. You want to experience that, the beauty in art, or the beauty in the writing, right? Let me figure out what I'm trying to say right here. So if there's someone who writes beautifully, if there's someone who every single time you read their writing, you just forget about the writer and you're swept up in it, check it out, read it, get swept up in that art. And then what you want to do, so you read like a reader first. You read like a reader, you relax, you enjoy the book. If you really, really like something, I would actually recommend just jotting down that you like it or just making a quick note of it. Don't do anything with it yet. And then after you are done actually experiencing that, analyze it. Experience that. That art is meant to be taken in a specific way. That writer is trying to do something. When someone reads my story, the last thing I want them to do is walk away and be like, well, I analyzed your story and this 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 happened and this is how you did this and this is how you did this. It's just like, that's the most boring thing in the world. I don't really care that much. I mean, if I'm looking for constructive criticism, that's different. But if someone comes to me and they essentially grade my work and they grade it based on these specific rules that they have listed. They say these are the things that make a good story. Whether or not they make a good story, they give me a huge list. I'm going to just be like, I really don't care that much. Tell me if you like the story. Tell me why you like the story. And most of the time, if someone comes up to me and they tell me, hey, I didn't like the story, if they give me a constructive criticism and say that the pacing was weird, or they say that, if you change these things up, that's different. But there's something more to it, right? There's the actual aesthetic, and you can help create a better story by having those rules. But just remember that you want to have that aesthetic within your story. You want to have specific things happen in specific ways to bring about specific emotions, experiences in your reader. And I think it's the same thing for any type of. It's the same thing for any type of creative act, right? We're on a tightrope, right? We're on a tightrope. Doing anything creative, writing especially, you're existing in two different states. And I've actually heard this before. This idea is not from me, but this came up and I just remembered that somebody was talking about it. When you write, there are two different things you are doing. There is the act of creating, and there is the act of putting things into order. It's kind of like breathing. So if you don't know this already, when you breathe out, you naturally relax. All right. So if you breathe in, you're tensing up, and then when you breathe out, you relax. Okay. The creative act in writing, or the creative act in anything, is breathing out. You're relaxing. You're letting everything come to you, and you're not being judgmental about it. And this is kind of like humanity in general. And there's two different types of people as well. You take everything in. You're not being judgmental. You're not trying to say whether it's good or bad. You're just coming up with ideas. You're like, man, you're letting your mind wander. You're letting your mind take it the way it wishes. And this happens when you write too. When you write, you are also doing this as well. And then when you actually get done with that, coming up with ideas and being creative, you actually have to sit down. You have to assess your creative things. This is like, you're inhaling. You're inhaling, you're getting more tense. You're making order. You're giving those things order. When you write, you're kind of walking a tightrope between those things. When you write, you have to be creative, and you also have to be in contact with that orderly side of yourself. But I think it's going to be hard to be creative when you haven't experienced something in a creative way. When you haven't let something wash over you. When you haven't just let yourself be taken away by it. So, so I got through that. Sorry, I'm just looking at my notes, and I'm kind of ahead of myself. So remember that. So it's relaxation and it's stress, and it's a good type of stress, right? It's order. It's when you're actually focusing on something. And this actually reminds me of something else. So this actually can be expanded to your life in general. This is a principle that you can take and you can apply to different places. In your life, there are times when you need to be productive, and there are times when you actually need to take a break. If you are, and it depends on the person. Some people have really type A personalities and they can work super long hours and different things like that. Now, if you're single and you're doing that, go ahead. I don't care. If you have other people who depend on you, or you have people you know, then you need to take a rest for them, actually. A friend of mine actually, and I still remember this and I go back to it all the time whenever I'm talking about rest. So he's a big runner, and I don't know if he's still keeping up on running or what, but when he talked about running, he said this thing one time. He's like, you know what? When you're running, rest days are important to schedule in, because if you run all the time and you never take a rest day, your body isn't going to be able to recover. And in your daily life and in your creative life, this is the same exact thing. You need to schedule in rest. You need to schedule in times where you can just relax. And the reason, especially with creativity, that you need to do this is so that you can actually allow your mind to go into a state where you can allow different ideas to come in and you don't have to worry about it. It's that exhalation. It's a weird way to say it. That exhalation portion of creating. And then there's other times when you need to have discipline, where you need to get out, where you need to start running. I hate running, by the way. Where you need to start running because that's part of your training too. So the rest day is important. In your daily life, a lot of people work during the day and then they rest at night. Even if you're wealthy, even if you have tons and tons and tons of money, I still think your life should reflect that in some way. There should be productivity in your life, and then there should be times where you are not productive, where you are resting, where you're stepping back, where you're allowing yourself to actually have some time. One big thing in our culture is that people don't give themselves time to actually relax. What happens is you stop for lunch. And this is because of our jobs and different things like that, and I understand that. People have the inability to disconnect. That's what it is. You stop for lunch, and then people are like, I have half an hour, and they're constantly looking at their watch, and they're like, I have to get back to this. I would recommend, just for your own sanity's sake, but also if you're someone who does anything creative, to have a specific time. I do this myself. You have a specific time where you're like, these are my different tasks that I need to get done for the day, or this is work that I have for the day. Maybe you have some tasks you need to get done after work. At this point, I am done, and that's all I have to do for the day. After I'm done with that, I'm done. And the reason why I say you should do this is because it'll actually create first of all, you're going to be more productive if you build in rest. And second of all, you are actually, it's going to be a better system. You're not going to get burned out as quickly because you're going to be taking these small vacations every single day where you're just completely disconnecting from absolutely everything that's happening in your life. So the big takeaway from today is read like a reader. And I hope that applies. I hope you can actually take that and take the ideas I was talking about and apply it in a lot of different ways. The logical fallacy of the week. So I've told you before that I've run out of logical fallacies, so I'm repeating them. But I'm sure that nobody remembered all of them anyway, unless you're weird. But this week's logical fallacy is the broken window fallacy. And I've talked about this before, I'm certain. So the broken window fallacy is when you disregard other costs based on your action. Okay. Disregard other costs. So it's the terms that are used, how this is described is you're disregarding lost opportunity cost. And what it means in the real world, or what the typical example is that when you throw a rock at somebody's window, you can be like, well, that creates a job for someone who fixes windows. But you don't actually take into account that the person who owns the property has to pay for that window. And you don't, maybe they needed to actually buy food with the money they need to pay for that broken window now. So they could have bought food, or they could have bought new clothes for their kids. And you're actually not allowing them to do that because you broke that. So it's a logical fallacy when you're like, well, I think this actually applies to people who throw trash on the ground. There are some people, and I think it's few and far between, but you hear about it, where they're like, that person's job is to clean up. Therefore, if I throw trash on the ground, it's okay. It might be the case that it's their job to clean that up, right? But maybe they could have been doing something else more productive. Maybe something needed to be fixed. and they aren't able to do that anymore because you're throwing trash on the ground, you jerk. If you enjoy this podcast and would like to support me more, what I would ask you to do is that you go to iTunes and you leave a 5-star review. That is something that really, really helps me and helps push the podcast out to different people. And it's something that doesn't cost you much time at all. So if you would do that, I would really appreciate that. And I definitely appreciate everyone who listens to this podcast. If you ever listen to this podcast and you have questions or you have topics you would like me to cover, you can send those to me and I'll look them over and I'll see which ones I think I can cover intelligently. And if you just want to reach out for anything at all, you can do that as well. Thanks for your time. My name is Daniel Poppy, and as always, this is How to Write Good.